The evening of my engagement was supposed to be filled with laughter, light, and celebration. I had waited years to introduce my fiancé to my entire family under one roof, especially my grandmother, who had raised me after my father passed away. She was fragile now, sitting in her favorite wheelchair near the corner of the room, smiling at the music and the decorations. I could tell she was proud of me. My mother, on the other hand, looked beautiful yet tense. Her smile didn't reach her eyes, and every time she glanced at Grandma, something darker flickered behind that polite mask she always wore in public. As guests arrived, the house glowed with the warm colors of candles and roses. My fiancé, Ethan, kept his arm around me, whispering little reassurances, knowing how complicated my relationship with my mother was. Mom had never forgiven Grandma for taking me away when I was 10. She always said Grandma stole me after Dad's death. But in truth, Mom had left me, chasing a new marriage, a new life. When she returned years later, she pretended everything was fine, but the bitterness never left her eyes. Tonight, though, she acted perfectly loving, hugging me, helping the servers, even giving Grandma her favorite seat near the cake table. It was almost unsettling how kind she seemed. When it was time for the toast, Mom called everyone's attention. She raised 2 glasses of wine, her smile stretched thin. To family, she said sweetly, handing 1 glass toward Grandma. I stood nearby, something in my chest tightening. There was something too deliberate in the way she extended that glass, the way her eyes darted briefly toward me, then back to Grandma. Her tone was light, but her fingers trembled, and her lips curved in a strange, almost satisfied smile. I had seen that smile before, years ago, when she'd burned one of Grandma's letters in front of me and said, "Some people deserve silence." My instinct screamed, maybe it was paranoia, maybe love, but in that split second, I stepped forward and said cheerfully, "Here, Grandma, let me take that to you." I swapped the glasses when no one noticed, giving her the one Mom had set down earlier and keeping the one Mom had just handed out. Everyone clapped as Mom made her toast, and the room filled with laughter again. I lifted the glass to my lips, pretending to take a sip. The wine tasted slightly off, bitter, metallic, wrong. My heart started to pound, but I stayed quiet. Grandma smiled and took a small sip from her own glass, completely unaware. The music resumed, and everyone returned to their conversations. Mom came to stand beside me, still smiling that eerie smile. "You did well, darling," she said softly. "Grandma looks happy." I nodded stiffly, feeling the strange warmth from the wine spread down my throat. My stomach twisted, but I forced a laugh. "Yes, she does." Minutes passed. My mother's laughter rang out across the room as she chatted with guests. Then suddenly, her voice faltered. She gripped the edge of the table, blinking rapidly. A sharp gasp escaped her lips as she stumbled forward. Someone screamed. I froze as she fell, the glass slipping from her hand and shattering across the floor. Guests rushed toward her. Grandma's face turned pale as she called out, "Maria!" People began shouting for help. Ethan pulled me back, his voice urgent. "Call an ambulance." My mother lay motionless, her lips bluish, her breathing shallow. In the chaos, I stood rooted, the glass still in my hand. The taste on my tongue turned to iron. I realized what must have happened. Whatever was in that wine wasn't meant for me. It was meant for Grandma. As the paramedics arrived, I felt my legs shaking uncontrollably. They carried my mother out on a stretcher, the room buzzing with confusion. Grandma was crying softly, whispering prayers, while I stared at the wine stain spreading across the white tablecloth like a secret that could no longer be contained. Ethan held my shoulders, asking what happened, but I couldn't speak. My mind was running through every small sign I had ignored, the strange smile, the 2 kind words, the way Mom's hands trembled. Later at the hospital, the truth began to surface. The doctors said she had ingested something toxic mixed with alcohol. They didn't know how or why yet, but they were running tests. When the police asked questions, I felt a cold sweat on my skin. I wanted to tell them everything, but part of me couldn't process it yet. The woman who gave birth to me had just tried to kill her own mother, and by fate or instinct, I had stopped her. Grandma sat beside me quietly, her frail hand resting on mine. She didn't ask questions. She just looked into my eyes, and I knew she understood more than I could ever explain. Her voice was low, almost trembling. "Sometimes," she said, "the truth shows itself when we least expect it." That night, I went home and stared at the untouched glass still sitting on the table, a thin ring of red at the bottom. The house was empty now, silent except for the faint hum of the refrigerator. My reflection in the glass looked pale and unfamiliar. I thought of my mother, of how anger had poisoned her heart for so long. Maybe that poison finally turned on her. The moment my mother collapsed at my engagement party, time seemed to freeze. 1 second she was laughing, the next she was gasping for breath, her face twisting in pain before she hit the floor. The guests screamed, some rushing to help, others backing away in shock. I stood frozen, my mind refusing to accept what had just happened. My glass was still in my hand, the taste of the bitter wine lingering on my tongue. The very wine she had prepared with that strange, knowing smile. I realized in horror that she had drunk what she meant for someone else. Paramedics arrived quickly, pushing through the crowd as Ethan held me back. My grandmother sat motionless, clutching the tablecloth, tears falling silently down her wrinkled cheeks. She didn't need to ask what happened. The look in her eyes told me she knew. She had lived long enough to recognize the consequences of hate. As they carried my mother away, my hands shook uncontrollably. I felt guilt, shock, and disbelief all at once. My heart kept repeating the same thought. If I hadn't swapped the glasses, it would have been Grandma lying there. At the hospital, hours passed in a blur of flashing lights, whispered questions, and sterile hallways. The doctors said she had been poisoned, something had been mixed into her wine. The police took statements, asking where the bottle came from, who poured it, who had access to the drinks. I wanted to scream the truth, that my mother had tried to harm my grandmother. But saying it out loud felt impossible. How could I admit that my own mother would go that far? I just told them I didn't know, that everything happened too fast. When they finally let us see her, she was pale and still, connected to tubes and monitors that beeped softly. I stood at the foot of her bed, numb. This was the woman who had given me life, who had abandoned me, and who had now tried to take another life. I didn't know whether to cry or to hate her. Ethan placed a comforting hand on my shoulder, but I barely felt it. My mother's eyelids fluttered, and for a second her gaze met mine. She tried to speak but her voice was a faint whisper. "Why?" she murmured weakly. "Why did you?" Then her eyes closed again as the nurse rushed in to check her vitals. The next morning, I returned home with Grandma. The house that had been full of laughter hours before now felt heavy with silence. The spilled wine still stained the floor, a dark reminder of everything that had shattered. Grandma sat quietly by the window, her expression unreadable. After a long silence, she spoke softly. "Your mother never forgave me. She thought I took you away from her." Her voice trembled, but she was the one who walked away. I just picked up the pieces she left behind. I sat beside her, my heart breaking. "She could have hurt you," I whispered. Grandma nodded slowly. "Hate blinds people, my dear. It starts as a spark and becomes a fire that consumes everything around it. Even the ones they love." A week later, the police called again. They had examined the bottle of wine and found traces of a dangerous herb compound, something that could cause organ failure if ingested in large amounts. It wasn't an accident. They asked if my mother had any enemies, or if she might have been the target. I didn't know what to say. The truth was too cruel to speak aloud. When my mother finally woke up, I went to see her alone. She looked frail, almost unrecognizable, her once proud face softened by exhaustion. For a long time, neither of us spoke. Finally, she turned her head slightly toward me. "You switched it," she whispered. I didn't answer. Her lips trembled. "You always protect her." There was no apology in her voice, only bitterness. "I protected you too," I said quietly. "You could have died." Her eyes filled with tears, but she looked away. "You should have let it happen," she muttered under her breath. That broke something inside me. For years I had wished she would change, that maybe beneath her anger there was still a trace of love. But in that moment, I realized she had chosen her hatred over her family. I left the room without another word. Outside the hospital, the cold wind hit my face, and I felt a strange sense of relief. For the first time, I understood that love could not heal everything. Some wounds ran too deep. Weeks passed. The engagement resumed quietly, without the grandeur of the first celebration. Grandma insisted I move forward with my life, to stop letting the past poison my happiness. She said, "Let your mother live with her choices. You don't have to carry them anymore." I nodded, though the ache in my chest still lingered. Later that night, I sat alone on the porch, looking at the stars. I thought of my mother, the woman who could have shared in my happiness, who could have held my hand on my wedding day, who could have been part of the family she once lost. Instead, she had chosen bitterness. She had let anger twist her love into something dark and destructive. Still, I couldn't hate her. Maybe that was my weakness, or maybe it was the last gift my grandmother's kindness had taught me, to forgive without forgetting, to understand without excusing. I whispered into the night, I hope you find peace someday, Mom. Inside the house, Grandma's laughter floated faintly from the living room, soft and genuine. It reminded me that despite everything, life could still be beautiful. Love could still exist, even when it had been broken. And maybe that was the real ending to this story, not the poison, not the betrayal, but the choice to rise above it.